Okay, guys, let's keep going on Unit 4. We're still talking about microorganisms and disease, and we're talking about humans as hosts, and we're talking about our normal microflora. Um, Having a look at this slide right here, what it's trying to point out is all the different places where we can find um, bacteria growing. So in our little table up here, it gives us a list of species. The bacteria that would grow, and then down here we have locations on the body where these species would grow. And if you look at the pie charts, you'll notice that the more colors they have on here, the more diversity we find uh, on different places of our body. So the important thing to take from this slide is the distribution. So where all of these different species are living, and of course the different diversity. Oh, well, that doesn't come out well at all. But the diversity that we can see of the species that live on our skin. Here's a video you can have a look at. It's going to compare microorganisms and disease, of course. For these recorded lectures, I'm not going to show the videos to save some time, but you guys can certainly watch them from your notes. Okay, so let's get back to this idea of an opportunistic bacteria that we talked about earlier. I mentioned MRSA. And we can look at bacteria as not necessarily being opportunistic from their point of view, but from our point of view, they're opportunistic. If they have a chance to cause infection, they will. They don't act in your best nature. They act in their best nature, of course. So they don't think, oh, I better not harm this person. They think, oh, I have a chance to get extra food, or I'll have access to this tissue that I didn't have before. So we can be infected by a lot of these microorganisms. If they have a chance, if they have an opportunity, then they can become pathogenic. So often we'll call these opportunistic pathogens. Generally, this happens when we have a weakened immune system, if we're wounded, if we have an open wound, or if we have an altered microbiota, which can happen if we're taking antibiotics for a long period of time. Like I said before, generally our microbiota will not cause disease. When there are cases when they will. For example, if there's a lack of competition from commensals, so when we're saying commensals, we're saying the organisms that live happily on us, they benefit, but they do us no harm. If those organisms aren't there anymore, for example, if you're taking a long course of antibiotics, then we have a chance for opportunistic pathogens to move in and can cause disease. Another thing that generally contributes to us becoming infected is if bacteria move into places where they shouldn't be. So like we mentioned earlier, Staphylococcus aureus grows happily in our nose, but if it gets introduced to a wound, for example, in our skin, we can see a pretty bad infection come from that. So this is what we refer to as an opportunistic bacteria. It gets into a place where it shouldn't, and if it does get into that place, then it's a good chance or an increased chance that it can cause disease. Some of the examples we have down here: Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Salmonella species. They'll live relatively happily along with us, but if they get a chance, they can cause infection. And of course, we already talked about strep and Staphylococcus species. Now, where can we find our normal microflora? Where do they grow mostly on our bodies? What do they contribute there? Well, if we look at this list right here, we can see there's lots of places where we can find normal flora. And we've plated stuff from our fingers, from our hands and stuff before, so we know bacteria grows on our skin. So one of the major places we'll find bacteria growing is, of course, on our skin. It's exposed to the environment. Bacteria have a chance to move in. And we'll find more bacteria growing in your armpits, in your groin, and the soles of your feet, and definitely on your hands. I know if you've been repeatedly warned in the last months to wash your hands as one of the most effective means of preventing COVID. So we know that our hands are quite susceptible to having bacteria and viruses on them. We'll also be able to find bacteria in hair follicles, sweat glands, parts of our respiratory tract, our nose, our nostrils, our buccal area, which refers to our throat, back of our throat. We'll find bacteria in our digestive system and in our urogenital tract. Now, if you think back to when we talked about culturing bacteria, we said that bacteria need to have certain conditions in order to grow healthily or to grow happily. And some of these conditions are going to be some things such as the moisture level, the pH level, the temperature, salinity, the presence or absence of waste products, as well as the presence of other microbes, the commensals like we talked about on an earlier slide. These things are all going to play a role on where and how many or the diversity of bacteria we can find living in a given area. Now, our skin, for example, is what we call a very dynamic area. And when we're talking about dynamic, we mean it changes a lot. And if you think about it, of course, our skin's exposed to the environment constantly, so it is going to change. It's going to change depending on the environment. It has a variety of different textures, thicknesses. Some areas are moist, some areas are quite dry. We'll tend to find more growth in areas that are moist, and we'll tend to find a little bit less growth in areas that are dry. So for example, if you think about your forearm or the area of your upper arm or upper leg, that skin is going to be relatively dry. If you look at the skin that's found in your groin or in your armpits, that's going to be moist because we sweat and we trap moisture there. So we're going to find more bacteria that grow in your armpit, for example, than we would on your arm. And that's why if you go to the gym and you come back and you leave your sweatshirt on the floor in your room, you didn't clean up, then your sweatshirt, your arms, your armpits are going to be smellier than what you would if you smelled your sleeve. It's just the way it goes. More bacteria transfers to the shirt, and that's why it smells. We're also going to find areas on the skin that have different pH, and that's going to allow some species to grow, some species to not grow. Right at the base of our hair follicles, and you guys have seen this in other biology courses, we get the little pits that grow right around the hair shaft. We're going to have sebaceous glands and sweat glands that move in there, and those are going to be anaerobic, believe it or not. So that's not going to have much air, and that'll allow anaerobic bacteria to grow there. But the most places we'll find bacteria in the skin are going to be the armpits, the groins, the soles of the feet, and of course our hands. Now, if we look at the respiratory tract, and if you guys can think back to Biology 1200, you'll know that we've got two divisions, right? We've got our upper respiratory tract, and we get our lower respiratory tract. For general purposes, the upper respiratory tract are going to be the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, and it's basically going to stop at the larynx. Anything below the larynx is going to be considered our lower respiratory tract. Now, in our upper respiratory tract, we will tend to find a lot of different species and a lot of bacteria. Your nose, your sinuses, the back of your throat, your teeth, your mouth, and so on. We'll find a lot of species of bacteria, and we'll find a lot of numbers of bacteria. Once we get to the lower respiratory tract, so we get down into the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchiole, and the lungs. So this is actually going to be a part of the lungs. We consider that part of our respiratory system sterile. So hopefully we won't find any species down here. If we do, then we generally tend to have illness. So if we think about our upper respiratory tract, it's moist and it does support microorganism blooms. When I say in blooms, what I mean is quick growth or lots of growth of bacteria. A lot of the microflora that we're going to find in this part of our respiratory tract is viral, so you tend to get colds, flus, for example. They tend to settle in our upper respiratory tract, our sinuses, the back of our throats. In some cases, though, we can get bacterial infections. Strep throat, for example, is one, or we can have fungal infections, which would be something like thrush, or helminth, helminth is another word for worm. We can have parasitic infections in our mouth and our upper respiratory tract for sure. We do have a lot of things in place here that will defend our upper respiratory tract. For example, we have cilia that remove and filter out microorganisms. We have mucus in the upper respiratory tract, which will trap pathogens. Cilia then can remove that mucus in order to prevent those bacteria from causing infection. And we also have hairs in our nose that acts as a filter as well and helps remove bacteria before they ever get a chance to form an infection. The lower respiratory tract, LRT, that's normally clear of pathogens. So like again, that part is going to be what we consider sterile. We can, however, be subject to infections down in the lower respiratory tract if there's damage to the area or we somehow allow microorganisms to get into there. Also, things such as smoking, air pollution, and certain gases can cause damage in your lower respiratory tract, and that can increase your chances of getting bacteria in there and getting an infection and causing pneumonia. If we break down the respiratory tract a little bit in more detail, we'll see. We'll talk about the nose and the nostrils first. There's lots of bacteria found in this part of the upper respiratory tract, but we're not terribly sure about its beneficial function right now. Well, we know it's going to be commensal, and it's going to cause competition amongst pathogens. We also know that we can find that novel class of antibiotic that we talked about earlier, but we're not terribly sure where the benefits come in here. We have done lots of work, however, to catalog these, so we have a good idea what species live there, but again, we're not quite sure how they benefit us. So two species we talked about earlier, Staphylococcus aureus and Streptococcus pneumoniae. Those are two species. There's other species here from the phylum Firmicutes and then the class Clusteridia, and some of these species are also found in our gut, so not just limited to our upper respiratory tract. Now, if we move into our buccal area, this is generally what we consider our mouth and the back of our throat. We have a lot of bacteria in this part of our respiratory tract. Between 100 and 200 species live in our mouth, back of our throat. Over 100,000 living bacteria can grow on each tooth. When you wake up in the morning, you've got a bad taste in your mouth, you've got that bad breath. Those are bacteria that's been happily multiplying in your mouth overnight, and their metabolism is what's causing your breath to be stinky. Most of the species in our mouth are made up of streptococci, so if we take a swab from your tooth, for example, more than likely we're going to find cocci bacteria growing in chains, and they make up the bulk of our species, and most of these are beneficial. They're commensals, they prevent pathogens from moving in. One species in particular, Streptococcus mutans, that's one of the species that undergoes anaerobic fermentation. It creates acid, and that leads to tooth decay. And this can cause inflammation of the gums and then the periodontum, and this can lead to a bunch of other health issues, believe it or not. The mouth, if you think about the environment of the mouth, it contains lots of nutritions, lots of secretions. It's moist. It's got perfect temperature. It's a great place for bacteria to grow, and as a result, we see a lot of species growing in the mouth and the back of the throat. Alright guys, I'm going to end the lecture for today at this point right here. If you've got any questions at all as you're going through the videos, don't forget to jot them down, and I will see you in the virtual classroom to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.